Hello. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Manuel, for...
Sorry for the drilling, but...
well, it's... Yeah, I mean, like, sorry for it ourselves, for providing this space. It's very difficult to find perfectly silent spaces in Hong Kong, as it is to find perfectly dark spaces as well.
No, it does not.
I think it worked a little bit with the tempo of your performance, or we read the tempo based on this noise. I guess it's always like that a little bit. We don't have so much time, so there will be definitely an opportunity for you to ask questions about your performance, but I would like to discuss more about the exhibition, which is open and available for you to see upstairs. It's off now while we have this program, but it opened yesterday, and it will be available every day on our regular opening days, with our regular opening times in the weekends and slightly shorter opening hours during the weekdays. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the genesis of this way of working. And I know that your project in Venice will come up, and it's, I guess, an important step in your development of conceptualizing a certain type of performance within an exhibition context. But I think it would be interesting to go a little bit further, and in your thinking in general, as an artist, as a choreographer, and how you position yourself in what we're calling with this book the new performance turn.
Yeah. Okay, so you want me to develop a bit of like how I conceive this exhibition, or
yeah, but where does your interest in, and where do all your ideas about placing living bodies in exhibition spaces come from, and how was your experience coming from the field of dance and approaching first in a more lateral manner the visual arts? So
I guess in this text that I read and in some of the emails, you could understand that I also have some kind of a critical perspective on it, which is related to this kind of economy of experience. But my main interest, of course, after the Venice Biennial project was, it's basically it's the specificity of performance is, of course, time, and I think it's quite an interesting tension, and it's a good tool to sort of bring together two very different temporalities, that of the visual arts or the gallery space or the museum, which presupposes all these opening hours and is more of an individualized experience, to quote someone like Dorothea von Hantelmann. And the time of the theater, or of the, we're coming from dance or performance or concert or music, where it's more of a communal experience, So it was interesting to somehow be in a space which historically, politically has been designed more for a kind of individual experience, and see how these very different temporalities, because performance's main time is in the now, and as long as it lasts, even if it's a gesture or a movement or a moment, and see how that negotiates with other spaces. So I thought it's not only formally, but it's like an interesting place to experiment with time, actually. And more specifically regarding this work, the exhibition, I used already, like you mentioned, the strategies of enactment and embodiment, and sometimes working with already existing material, which is transformed from its original medium into something else. And in this case, when I arrived in Hong Kong, following your invitation and working also with Chang, I thought it would be interesting to look at more like the performance history, so less at a very broad art history, including paintings, sculptures, and history of art. So I was like, okay, I will look at performance. And then I went to Taiwan. I also looked for performance, and it was quite striking that most examples, especially in Taiwan, and a lot of the information I got in Taiwan was based around the noise movement and a lot of sound and music groups, and they were very closely connected to social movement. And then I was like, okay, so this conversation came up all the time. and the relationship to social movements. And then I came somehow to this idea of the title, like movement in the sense of the grammar of dance and choreography, but also movements in a wider perspective, like social movements. And so I wanted to have formations of bodies in space that I took from photographs and real kind of footage from streets and protests, but it's not related to only one protest or demonstration. It's like historically, from the 60s and 70s, different in different situations. So I looked and I was interested to abstract these formations, which in the street have a very concrete context, and bring it in the exhibition space and make like a correspondence to the performing bodies of performance artists, which sometimes were quoting some of those, like this little known by many people first performance of Ricky Leung, which was not the crawling, which is the famous one from Out of Context, but this, it's not the cage from Out of Context, but this crawling. And he was attempting to embody scavengers, like so-called central people, in this crawling. And then I found a very recent image of a protest or kind of a movement done by the scavengers, but it's recent, it's like 2014 and 15, and they were also crawling or having these positions. So then I thought there's some kind of transfer or a correspondence between them. And another thing which I was interested with, also with the songs, which are coming all from an archive presented in Taiwan by Jep and Amy. Help me with the second name. Jep and Amy, yeah. And it's all documenting protest songs, but not only, but many protest songs, which are also not very widely circulated or known. And I thought that all the texts that I read and all those performances and songs were primarily performed by the body or by bodies, but they mainly circulate in the, let's say, art world or archive as documents, as photographies or sound archives, And I thought, what if I bring them back into the body, so, or like re-embody them, so like actualize them anew, of course in a completely different time, and the aim is not to reconstruct their authenticity or something like that, but to kind of remediate them back in the body and through the body. So where they kind of originally were. And that's also because I read texts by Amy and a lot of people from Taiwan, and there was always, especially with the noise movement, there was always it was always discussed, not only in terms of the music, but also in terms of like a kind of a social body which interferes or interpolates somehow social and society, and it's quite political, So I thought that, recirculating it by us singing, excerpts of it, of course, it would bring it somehow back into the body, So this was, I'm sorry to, I talk too much, but it's okay.
No, it's okay. That's what we're doing here, so it's okay. If I would have to ask you to describe like the situation upstairs with all these elements being composed together, what would be? Is it a sort of a landscape? Is it a narrative?
Yeah.
Is it a tool for representation? What would be like the best?
The landscape is good, and it's maybe a good opportunity to say something about the carpet. That is not just some kind of...
I meant landscape.
No. But it's not just a fantasy. I thought it should be colorful. Like I'm here. It's coming from the. I took somehow this example of the Zuni
icosahedra.
Sorry. As a kind of a blueprint for the work, because I met one of the dancers, of the older dancers. And he told me about this piece called 100 Years of Solitude, which many of you know, which was conceived in '82. And then it was repeated. It had at least 9 versions. So it was like a ongoing, for me, show, So every year they were redoing it, changing it, but still it was the same title, the same show. So it was interesting to see this kind of persistence within a medium which is often or usually associated with the ephemeral, like, oh, it's happening and then it's gone. But they were kept on going, like repeating this piece on and on and on, as if it, for me, it had a different temporality, you know, like a sculpture. And then, because the Zuni means this progression between green and blue, I thought maybe that to try to take it literally and have the landscape, like you say, so like we are basically on this Zuni. And also it was because they explained me that in '82, they're one of the main thoughts behind the work was, I mean, that's their position, yeah, the group, the anxiety related to the imminent handover in '97. But that happened in '82. So I thought, okay, you're quoting or bringing that, but now it's 20 years after it has actually happened. So there's this question they were addressing, and then for an audience that comes now, it's this kind of vehicle, like in time, that you will think, okay, they had this kind of expectations or anxieties, what has happened, what do I think, and so on. So it kind of also situates you, I thought. So yeah, I think a sort of living environment is a good, that also reacts to how the audience transforms it or not. And one last thing to say, I know we are late. Another, because it's quite simple, the structure, and it's simple, the enactment, and it's difficult to enact works that originally were performative or performance, because it is a question on how you transfer it, or how do you keep something from that intention, but without, of course, attempting to claim any kind of authenticity or so on, or a proper reconstruction. And then I thought, but it's also coming from protest, because when I was looking at pictures, and this again is not specifically Hong Kong or China, but of course some examples are local, but I think they work in alliance with broader, you know, like people can relate to those bodies, is that lately I have seen a lot of protests, or people, actually protest is maybe too powerful or misleading, people standing up in general to injustice or inequality or so on. And I've seen many protests starting from, you know, like one person that kind of takes the courage or the responsibility, and then it multiplies. So the one becomes the many, because people decide to join. So for example, one of the examples we talked to the performers often was the standing man in Istanbul. Yeah? And so there's someone who decides to have this very clear, it's actually just a position occupying the space, yeah? Just standing, looking at a particular picture, of course. And this kind of informs, and as performance does, it kind of commands in a certain way the space, if there's an intention. And then people notice it and start joining him, and they just copy the same position. So he becomes many, and then, you know, you could say that if you go and see someone in a bus stop standing, you can have this recollection of the standing man. So it kind of goes viral, but it's also instaurated through other bodies that decide. And then I've seen many. So here there was one protest in the 60s against the increase, when the kind of British governor wanted to increase the fare for the Star Ferry. And there was this one guy that sort of climbed the fence, and he had a message on his back. And it was quite risky for him. But then others joined him, you know. So each performative action is transferred from one that originally did it, in most cases, like one performer, and is repeated by more. So it's multiplied into other bodies. And also it becomes different. And I also think it's more specific. I mean, here you can be, I don't know, angry with me, but it's more specific to dance and choreographical practice, which its modality of preservation is repetition. So you have kind of a score, and you repeat it, and you pass it on to other bodies, like the choreography or the musical score. And maybe less coming sometimes from performance art, which emphasized often this uniqueness, like the one action done by only one,
Okay, but then since you brought this up,
sorry.
You don't have to apologize after every
I know, I'm tired.
answer. Since you brought this up, I mean, I think it's important to discuss about one of the, you know, important issues at stake here: exhibition versus performance, and how would all these elements that you mentioned work if this would be a choreographic piece that would be 1 hour long and happening on a stage
Yeah,
with the
of course.
repetition that comes. Like, what is it about the format of an exhibition that adds to all these elements that you composed? This is one question, and related to this, I think it would be good to also understand, like, since you chose, based on our invitation, but and structure, but you chose to, work in the context of an exhibition, and it's you maintain the word exhibition in the title, and etymologically and structurally, exhibition presupposes the act of showing something, and a certain idea of object is implied, and it's impossible to extricate completely. So the question is, like, what is actually on view upstairs? Are the performers? Are there their bodies, their movements? Is it still a sort of a narrative or a choreographic situation that they create? What is ultimately the object of?
Yeah, I think it's good, the word object. There is kind of an object. There's this kind of
what is the
different object. The object are, of course, yes, the movements, the actions, their presence, but it also like implies that sometimes it's not there. So, like when the gesture sort of finishes, it's also kind of gone. And it goes back in the memory, but then it, of course, can be re-performed again, And that's kind of what's interesting. And I'm a little bit more reluctant to use this terminology like dance is ephemeral and so on, because I don't think, in fact, is. I think it's like it is, but kind of it's hard to destroy or exhaust an idea. Like, it really can be passed on, as I said, a choreography or a musical score, or even orally, and it sort of persists, but it's just a very different object. So yeah, what's on display is actions and movements. But I think this brings it also, your question brings us back to the book, because in the book you have lots of positions of different, some very critical, some very, discussing very much in favor of the so-called new performative turn, or the second or the third, I don't know, it's also controversial. So you have lots of practitioners, but also lots of curators that have programmed or invited more and more works of dance or performance in their museums, galleries, and so on. And I think maybe only my answer won't suffice, but the book is quite a good blueprint.
But maybe just to quickly answer the first question of, like, what is it about the format of an exhibition that gives its own imprint to your work versus having done it as a performance piece?
But I think it's very much what I said in the beginning. Yeah. I mean, it's not conceived in this case, because there are people who work in galleries, like, for example, Anna Imhoff, that everyone probably have seen recently, who insists on the fact that it does have a beginning and an end. It functions like an opera, which lasts 5 hours, and so on. In this case, it's not conceived as like having a beginning and an end. And it's quite important that, not that it loops, because it's sort of problematic, but that it's kind of ongoing. So it's still the temporality difference, like the specificity of an exhibition, but with the time of a performance. I don't know. I don't know if it's clear, but you can maybe also open the floor. So.
Yeah, no, we're going to do that. Good. Are there questions?
Because how late? I mean, you have to.
But we should take some questions.
For sure. No.
There are, yes.
I feel strange with this because everything I say.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your performance. My question is, for what I understand from your discourse, is that the central theme of your performance pretty much is about protest. I haven't seen the performance yet, but I will. Now, I just want to ask you, in this context, in the lecture performance that just happened, was that a protest to the conventional means of a lecture, for example? And if yes, can you maybe elaborate or add on any other means you would also use as a protest, for example?
So you mean if this was a protest and what I would do as a protest?
Yeah, pretty much. If no, then never mind. Yeah.
No, I don't think it's a protest. I think it's like, I was doing, several works, but in this case, when I was invited to do, several works reflecting a bit on this regime of the visible, what's visible, what's invisible, what remains, and it's also like a very strong, especially in the visual art context, visibility and the visual is very important, but it's mainly a sense, like a distancing sense, because it's like you take this critical distance to see something, yeah. And there are some interesting texts, for example, by an anthropologist called Margaret Mead, which like a very long time ago, she was very critical to the museum and the exhibition because she said that it does not involve all senses. It prioritizes only the visual. And that's for her like a primarily, sorry if I go to theoretical, modernist, distancing critical. And then she would like the whole being to be involved in. I mean, it's an old text. So I was also thinking a little bit about that, like what does it mean to suspend for a bit or for a moment this regime of visibility and address maybe other senses. This was my main, yeah. But then following it up, I arrived at these questions of like, the economy of experience, the economy of presence, which some commentators have addressed that, performance becomes instrumentalized in the visual arts context primarily because of that, yeah. So like, some of these examples, which fortunately are not all and not that many, like, people wanting it to be very quick and very kind of cheap, but with a maximum output. So it's not really a protest. It's more like I'm trying to just reflect on this condition or what is happening. And I don't know if I answered it.
Okay, maybe just to add on, if visibility was then the tool for discernment between, about your work, have you thought of making it completely invisible?
Yeah, I did actually. But I mean, so this solo in the dark was in total pitch dark, and but it's not so easy to get spaces dark. And then I also thought it's fine to suggest it. I mean, the darker it is, the more also like the feeling of disorientation. Like, for example, if you sit and you rehearse in darkness for a long time, sometimes you feel like you need to touch your body to know that it's still there, Like kids sometimes do that in the dark if they play, So it's a kind of not disembodying, but it's like there is a very strong physical experience if you're in complete darkness. But I accepted that it's okay now. I mean, we won't paint the walls black and just for me for 20 minutes. So. But yeah, the piece I did before it was, which I will not brag about it, but like it's also very hard, this regime of visibility, to break in theaters because it's full of exit signs and regulations. So sometimes I thought it was harder to make dark, just switch off the light. I mean, as simple as you would go in your bedroom and switch off the light, it's easier to do a very complex, light design than to get it dark. You need approvals, you have to speak with the firemen, they have to stand there and move in case there is a fire. It's like kind of hard, actually. So,
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Yes.
I'd like to go back to Cosmin's question about what does it mean to do these movements in an exhibition space, and I'm also thinking about the presence of the viewers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the viewers are on the same stage as the performers, so to speak. So what does their presence do to the performances? And I'm also interested in how time plays into that, in the sense that the presence of the viewer activates the piece, I assume, right? So, I mean, those are things that would be different, for example, from it being staged in a theater, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thank you for the question. I had one more part of the text, but I decided to not read it because I thought it was hard to follow with the. I mean, there is a certain amount. So there is one theoretician which says, also Dorothea von Hantelmann, that says that the exhibition space and the museum is actually a choreographic. It's actually a choreographic endeavor. That it's not only that you go and watch, look at objects, but actually the initial display favorizes people looking at other people. So when you walk, like in the theater, you have this very much, you have this anonymity. You have this kind of voyeur position. But in an exhibition display, which is also highly lighted, usually, you move on your own, and also you become very visible for others. So she thinks it's a highly choreographic procedure, you know, or I don't know how to call it, endeavor. And so, of course, like last night when we had the opening, just to give a more concrete example, the audience's, you know, not only reactions because it's not interactive, but the flow and the changes in their moods, of course, configures the space very differently, you know. Because at some point there was this rush to the cocktail in the back, then people got alert and they changed this sitting position, which was in the beginning, like everyone just sit, you know, quietly around to watch the show, which is more like a theater sort of, which is nice also because it's kind of time shared, you know. And they were sitting around, and then when there was this hush with the cocktails, people became much more active and moved and also occupied space in the center. Then another thing different from, so it changes time also, and the space configurates all the time differently, which is kind of interesting for me, because I come from dance. And in dance, I mean in like most conventional dance and theater, you always have frontal position, yeah? It's very strange to set a play, or that we would talk like this, you know? It's kind of, it's quite strange, because it's been so much, like convention has been so much rehearsed, you know? And then with dance, you usually don't get to go close, or to watch it from behind, or, you know, these kind of things. I think it's very visible in this work by, I don't know if you've seen it, this Anna Teresa de Kersmacher. She did a piece in Brussels and many places where she kind of stretched, she decomposed a dance piece made for the stage over 9 hours. I've seen it at Tate Modern in the big hallway, you know. And there is this thing which, you know, at some point the bodies become very sculptural because you go close to it and you change kind of the time of this experience, you know. So that's interesting for me. I don't know if I'm clear. And yeah, so there is the specificity of this exhibition display and this time specificity of the performance or theater that kind of crash, or I don't know, there's a friction. And I thought, I mean, I'm not sure yet, but I thought that it could produce an interesting outcome, you know, maybe. And the last thing, and I know, it's, I think, interesting in the sense of like, and many people are reflecting now around this issue of a kind of a more communal experience, you know, because the dispositive of the visual art is a very individualized. It's a very one-to-one. It's a very, you know, you do your own. You don't really need the others to look at a painting or go around the museum, you know. So it's a more of a shared time. Okay.
One more question. If there is.
We're late anyway, no?
Yes, okay. So if there's no question, we're going to move to the second part of the